So this is the last panel of the day. It's actually the best. Sorry, Roy. This is the most disruptive thinking panel all day, and it is the future. And that's why we have the most people assembled up here in the most different of dress. Thank you to Nat. So,
no jacket,
the future of digital health. Lynne Zydowsky and I are going to moderate or actually disrupt the thinking of the panelists here, who Lynne's going to introduce, and then we're going to actually move to a Twitter moment and then come back to attack the subject matter, which I think you'll find pretty fascinating. First of all, although it's the end of the day, let me welcome everybody here to the Alexandria Center for Life Science New York City, the only science park in the city here that's commercially oriented, and one we're very proud of, developed in conjunction with Mayor Bloomberg's vision to really diversify the economy of the city. We did a, seems like a long time ago, but I think, April 22nd, Lynn? We did a summit on digital health and brought together some of the most important thought leaders in the area, from academia, from many facets of business, pharma, bio, many commercial businesses, healthcare systems, payors. It was really an all-star cast, kind of like a Davos-like meeting, and we explored some critical issues of digital health, some of which you're going to hear today, and it was really out of the birth of that summit that the idea for this pre-Galien panel came about. So let me introduce Lynne, who's going to introduce the panel. Lynne is really a renowned entrepreneur, scientist, has been involved with the startup of quite a number of well-known companies, and is really a thought leader in this area of digital health. And so it's really my honor to work with her on this panel. So Lynne, take it away.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you to the Galien Foundation. We're honored to be a part of this meeting, and thank you to everyone who came to this last session today. So as Joel said, today we're going to talk about the convergence of healthcare and digital innovation. And as we are moving rapidly into the digital age of advances such as mobile technology and supercomputing and cloud computing and sensors, we are presented today with an unparalleled opportunity to vastly improve outcomes, empower patients, increase the quality of care, and lower the cost of healthcare. By leveraging the scalable digital technologies and big data, we will be able to make better informed and more effective clinical decisions. Digital health has the opportunity to revolutionize how the biopharma industry will develop new therapies, how doctors will diagnose and treat disease, and how patients will be able to better manage their own health. So today on our panel, we have thought leaders from both the life science and the tech industry with us today to explore this critical opportunity, which promises to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of our healthcare system and improve human health worldwide. So to briefly introduce the panel, and I think we did have in the seats some of the bios for the panel speakers. Our distinguished panel today include Dick Foster, who is a special advisor to the president of Yale University on healthcare innovation, and he's a director emeritus, McKinsey Company, and a venture partner at Lux. Ed Park, who is the EVP and Chief Operating Officer of Athenahealth. Athena, if you don't know, is a delivery cloud-based services company for EHR and care coordination. We have Nat Turner, who's a founder of Flatiron Health. Flatiron is one of the new, exciting, emerging digital health companies, big data digital health companies in the oncology space. We have with us Krishna Yeshwant, who's a general partner at Google Ventures, and Sachin Jain, who's the Chief Medical Information and Innovation Officer. He also lectures in healthcare policy at Harvard Medical School. And with this, I'm going to turn it back over to Joel.
Okay, so can you guys turn this on? Yep. Okay, so one of the things that we decided to do is ask each of the panelists to give us their Twitter moment, which they feel the most critical issues facing digital health today, and I guess when I turned on CNBC this morning, I think Twitter was down 30%, so I'm not sure they were anticipating the quality of comments here this afternoon, but let's hope not. So Dick, do you want to take it away?
Well, I think that I'm not sure I know what a Twitter moment is, but we'll find out in a second, because I'm going to give you an answer, and then you can judge me on whether it's a Twitter moment or
It's
not.
over. It's over.
Market is
It's over? It's over, that's my problem.
That's it.
Right?
140 characters.
So we can go on ahead then.
No.
But, we've got to improve the productivity of the system. We've just had a tremendous panel here talking about the most intense medical problem that is around. But it is also about how we put the system together, and the system is far from effective. So we need to wire the system and bring the cost of delivering these services down.
Ed?
I think that digital health is nowhere close to where it has to be. I think that we'll know that we've arrived or come close to arriving when digital health feels more like Amazon or Yelp or Kayak or any of the other places that you're familiar with. If you just think for a second about your experience on Kayak, your experience on Amazon, think to your experience on healthcare, that's the gap that we have to fix. And if you just let that sink in a little bit and think about what that means, there's so many layers of infrastructure that are broken under the surface that make it so you can't have the experience in healthcare, that I think that's the gap that we have to close.
Yeah.
So my big one is we're collecting a ton of data in healthcare, and Athena's in this boat. We use that data mainly for billing purposes today. There's not a ton of organized effort being put towards using that data to improve patient care. And we're already collecting this data. A lot of the plumbing has been laid and put down in the industry, but we just haven't figured out how to take advantage of it to improve outcomes yet.
Krishna?
So I work at Google, and I work as a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and so a lot of my time I spend trying to bring IT people and healthcare people together to be able to have the right sort of conversation.
Sachin?
So I would say don't confuse activity with achievement. In this field, there's a ton of smoke, not a lot of fire. I think the people in this room have the opportunity to actually create the fire. So let's go out and light some matches.
Okay, so before we get into, thanks guys, I'll tell you what the opening on Twitter was in the morning, and you can then judge your performance accordingly. So I'd like to start out the, say again?
Did you actually just tweet all of those?
We will shortly. So the first question I have for you, and then Lynne's going to kind of work through a more prearranged schedule is, okay, we're sitting right, I hate to tell you, right next door to Bellevue Hospital, which is now hosting, I guess, maybe two of the first set of, we hope maybe last, New York City cases of Ebola. Give us your thoughts on the intersection of digital health and Ebola, and maybe let's go in reverse order. Sachin, do you want to maybe give us your thought there?
Yeah, so I thought it was, I thought it was sort of amazing that that the EMR played a part in the story around Ebola. That when there were the sort of breakdowns that happened in Texas, that the first thing that we reached for in terms of blame was the computer, and I think that's something that important for us to think about as we start to integrate digital tools into clinical care processes. I think there are going to be a huge number of unintended consequences, but I think it's important for us to kind of think hard about what's human error, what's sort of computer error, and point the finger in the right direction. I think there's an opportunity to really accelerate the use of digital health tools if we think about them thoughtfully, and also, frankly, slow the adoption of digital health tools if we start pointing fingers at them when things start going wrong. So I think developing a good change management narrative around the integration of technology into clinical process is going to be very important.
Krishna, thoughts?
So I think of it in two pieces. One is inside the clinic where just the speed of access to the information of where patients are and whatnot could clearly be helpful as epidemics like this start to develop. I actually spend a lot more time now thinking about how digital starts to touch diagnostics and pharmaceutical. and even vaccine. Probably a lot of you have seen the New Yorker article, talking about sequencing and seeing how the Ebola virus itself is changing and how it's different from previous strains. So that's an area where I think we're still at the very beginning of where IT can start to touch the sequencing and the expression profiling, kind of that whole stack of data that we're still trying to get our hands on, and how does that sort of information look as you start to be able to collect it from all the different clinical touch points that we have, both here in the U.S. in the developed worlds as well as increasingly in the developing worlds.
So before I go to Nat, just one question for maybe Krishna or Sachin. The Economist had a brief article on the intersection of Ebola and digital health, and kind of said something to the effect, or had a debate, I guess, within the article about the call data records in West Africa. Do you guys have any view on that? Maybe Nat, maybe that's for you.
I have no opinion on the cold records over there, but I'll tell you, we were brainstorming at lunch today at Flatiron. We only care about cancer, but we were just at lunch talking about Ebola, and one of the ideas that came up, which speaks to Sachin's point on the EMR coming out as one of the first points of blame or scapegoats for this situation in Dallas, was kind of like how at the border, when you run your passport through, they run the check and they can kind of pull up a lot of information on you. It speaks to how it's a slippery slope, giving the government access to your medical records. But the idea would be, to somehow, it speaks to how siloed our healthcare information is today, let alone connecting to records in Africa. But if a patient walks into UT Southwestern, being able to quickly link that to, say, the travel records of maybe a government database, where the nurse can basically, in the same system, pull up and see their travel records right then and there. And we don't have that ability as a country to implement that kind of system because of how fragmented and siloed our medical record system is. But I know it's different than what you asked, but it's just something that we thought about today.
That's okay. Ed?
I think that there are digital records can play a role in that. So, for example, when the CDC put out its guidelines on Ebola, so, for example, if you've been in Ebola country and you've handled rodents or bats, then and your temperature is over 100 degrees, then you're supposed to do something about it. And so one thing that we did on behalf of the 50,000 doctors on our cloud-based clinical record is we inserted all of those questions into the workflow so that everyone at least had awareness of it. Now, with that said, I agree with Sachin. And until the point that they build computers that can then take a giant plastic bag and quarantine someone when you answer yes to both of those, then I think that there's room for human judgment that has to be in there as part of the equation, and digital health can't do it all by itself.
I think that's a great point. Dick?
Yeah, and it's, to me, I think we're all incredibly aware of what's happened with Ebola on a minute-by-minute basis. None of that would have happened without electronics. Now, we don't normally associate that with the healthcare IT system, but maybe we should, because we have a global system here that the awareness is extraordinary. I happened to be in Poland last week, and there's no difference in the awareness in Warsaw than there is in New York. It's absolutely amazing. I think another part of it is there's almost a naivete. We think that the digital health system in the United States has been built. And let me tell you, it hasn't, right? And we're not close and Ed knows all the details. But we're a long way. We're more at the beginning of the internet than we are at the end of the internet at this point. So the thought of having the capability in Africa right now to put these records together, I just think it's a little bit ahead of the game, and I think we ought to be realistic about where we are. And maybe we're getting the benefit of it through the news system right now. Maybe that's the digital health system we have.
Okay, so maybe I'll just stay on this for a minute with EMR, because electronic medical records, that's something that you see a lot in the news and everyone talks about. And then they also talk about this word interoperability. And, obviously that's what you're all saying is, we need to have everything integrated. And even in countries like the US, we're far from being there, as you said. So I would just like to talk a little bit more about this and what you think needs to be done, can be done in the near term. I'm going to start with you, Ed, because, Athenahealth, just what you said. You do have this cloud-based EMR record services.
We think that that interop is critical to the nature of a longitudinal health record in the country. I think that it's unlikely that we're going to move to a single vendor system across the entirety of the US, across all care settings, retail, inpatient, urgent care, outpatient, long-term care, et cetera. There's just too much in there to have any one vendor solve all the problems. And if you did have one vendor try to solve all the problems, you'd end up beginning to stifle innovation. But if you look again, and it's just been interesting to just take Amazon as an example. If you go to an Amazon webpage, under the covers, Amazon actually executes 200 to 300 web queries in parallel behind the scenes that all go out in return in sub-second time that produce a view that's personalized for you. That sort of interoperability is a market-driven perspective on interoperability that's completely missing from healthcare. There's no web services that are available in healthcare. Everyone should have those things available, but it doesn't exist. This is an example of why I say that we're going to know that we're close when you have that kind of interoperability in play. With that said, I think that we're still limping through government-defined standards for interop. They're much, much better than nothing. And you actually have a number of vendors who profit from creating closed islands of information so that no one can go in there and try to profit off the information in those silos. And so you have this really weird situation of the day where we're so far away from the market-driven interop that we need that any step in the direction of interop is a good one.
Why has it taken so long for companies like yours and others to target these areas, as opposed to, the Amazon businesses and the businesses that have been out there and have developed, under the broad banner of the internet?
I'll give my own quick answers to it.
It's taking so
but-
long.
We all probably have points of view on that, but
That's a fun one, and I'm sure that all you guys have a lot of perspectives on it as well. I think that there are a couple principal things. I think number one, there's the patient information third rail. There's the propriety of the patient information, security and safety of that information that has made it so that you end up having to have many more layers than you would have in, say, retail. On the other hand, we've gone through many of those same layers in banking, so we've solved it there, so it's a solvable problem. The other, honestly, is the fact that I think that many healthcare systems profit from being closed. And if you're a healthcare system, your job is to try to keep your patients bouncing around within the wall of your health system as long as is humanly possible. And you have no interest in building a connection that will allow a patient to leak out and go to a competitor health system. And so,
Bingo.
And so what ends up happening is that the health systems tell the vendors to not pay that much attention to interop, because when that happens, they start losing patients and they get mad. So
And the health systems tell patients, stay here because we know everything about you.
that's right. So it's this really crazy loop that happens as part of the equation. But I'll let others answer as well.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really challenging question. That's why I was kind of poking at Ed, because it seems like you guys have done a great job kind of answering what the market needs, or what the market's, at least what the market's asking for. And when I think of the Amazon example, because we're always thinking like, what is that thing? Is it goes back to the question of, well, who's your customer? And if your customer is ultimately a large health system or clinic or a payer, or something like that, that's not really what they're asking for. But then it begs the question, like, what is the app on, or the Google or the Facebook application that's going to actually engage the consumer? Because that does add a different access to the whole conversation. And I don't know, we spend a lot of time as a venture fund looking for that sort of thing. And I at least don't feel like I've seen that yet. I don't think I've seen kind of the application that the end consumer, at least in today's universe, will aggregate around in the same way that they've aggregated around kind of these digital platforms. And maybe that becomes possible as the environment shifts, as we've been talking about earlier today. But I'm curious if anybody's seen something of that nature, because if you have, I'd like to invest in it.
What, didn't you, just to push on that a little bit, can I? Push, just for fun. I mean,
Please.
We're all here. The idea of actually having a longitudinal view of a patient for the purpose of population health, say Medicare shared savings, so that you know that the patient who came into your office actually had a colonoscopy a year ago in a competing health system, but you don't do it today, so you actually reorder the same test, or the imaging study that is redone. In terms of just basic care, longitudinal care of a patient, understanding everything that occurs in that patient's history isn't.
Wouldn't that be a great thing for a patient to want, right? Like is that your?
Well, providers do want it in at-risk health systems, and the patients, I agree, are in the early stages of asking for it.
I think patients, I don't know, when I sit in my clinic and talk to my patients, they like don't even know. They're just not even aware that that's something that they can ask for. What they know is that their doctor in front of them has asked for another CT scan, and as far as they know, that's just the right thing to do. Or they know that, well, you did get a CT scan someplace else, so now my doctor's asking me to kind of go do this whole thing. And it just happens so infrequently for most people that it's hard for them to think of it as a consumer product. And you do have, I have a colleague of mine right now whose wife has an osteosarcoma, and she's kind of going through this whole thing, and he's doing a huge amount of work in the back end to kind of aggregate and collect the data so that all of the different doctors can take a look at it. But nobody else in our, that I know of in Google is struggling with that right now, right? It's kind of this one-off issue, and it just doesn't happen frequently enough. Just like it doesn't, it's not the same thing as buying, toilet paper or a book or something like that on Amazon. That it's become a consumer need that consumers are demanding, but not to say that it wouldn't be great if they would.
There's also a fundamental, I think, misassumption when people think about consumer application of digital health, which is that they assume that the patients want to manage their own information, and they assume that patients, are going to act on that information. Most really sick people just want to be taken care of, and I think that fundamental, gap is this sort of misunderstanding when it comes to consumerism and patient-facing digital health.
I totally agree with that, and this is we're not Amazon. I sit on the board of Memorial Sloan Kettering. We're regulated by 65 different entities. And at any one moment, and it happened this week, the Joint Commission can come in and say, we're shutting you down and we're having an audit. I don't think that happens at Amazon. And when you go buy a book on Amazon, you then don't go to your payer and see if they will pay for the book, right? It's very hard to draw the analogy between Amazon and healthcare, because healthcare is a regulated industry. If I don't like my book, I don't die. In healthcare, that could happen. So this is a totally different business, and I think trying to stretch these analogies to other industries is maybe a good parlor game, but I really don't think it leads us to any solutions.
Can I ask a question to Ed real quick? So the health information exchanges, the RIOs, the government efforts to connect systems.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on the sustainability of those efforts?
I think that health information exchange as a noun is unlikely to prosper because there's no business in it. Yeah. I think that health information exchange as a verb, so the ability to execute transactions, is likely to prosper over time. And just a couple of thoughts on, I think, both Krishna and Dick, I think your perspectives on this. I think that first of all, I think that on the initial consumer of healthcare, that I think the person who is going to ask for it first is likely to be the provider, not the patient.
Yeah.
And that the provider is going to be the person who actually wants to see the longitudinal view, who actually wants to see the Amazon view of the patient across multiple different care settings, and will know how to actually orchestrate the care of the patient across those care settings. And Dick, I think that ultimately, healthcare is a number of different. So it's $3 trillion, right? So it's a lot of different micro markets. Some of them, like MSK, will never look like Amazon. They won't. That's
the
the
aspirin
thing.
business will.
So there's some aspects of it that will, though.
And the
so
CVS portion of it will.
And so
but that's not where we're spending the money.
Well, we're spending an awful lot of money. Pretty much, $3 trillion, there's an awful lot of pools of billion-dollar chunks in there.
But 5% of the patients account for 35% of that total, right? So, and they're not taking aspirin, right? That's a totally different part of it. I, of course, agree with you.
Well,
with your
but
overall point.
There remains the other 65%.
But if we solved all the aspirin problem perfectly, I think we'd still be left with a $2.9 trillion problem. And you may not agree with that, but I think this is. I think we have to look at the big parts of the problem and think how we're going to solve those. I don't mind whittling away at the sides.
I think that, so if you basically break it into the third, that's the 1%, 9%, remaining 90% of healthcare.
Right.
I think healthcare IT can actually, I agree with you that it mostly will affect the bottom 2/3.
Right.
And the top third, I think, well, with respect to EHRs, the top third, which is what you're focused on, require a different kind of approach to the problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think that healthcare is a little bit different because if you go into a department store, you go to Amazon, there's a lot of engineers there that know everything there is about marketing and e-marketing and all that kind of stuff. Maybe someone in the audience can correct me, but I'm not aware that any medical school has a program in health information technology as part of their four-year program.
So I've thought a lot about that question, Dick. One issue is that the people who are going to medical school now are like the digital natives. They don't need the a lot of them don't need the program per se.
That's interesting.
So I mean, the reality is that my 21-year-old nephew he's like my IT support, and I use him for that stuff. And he doesn't need to take any courses. He grew up doing it. So I think what you're going to start to see is that these things will naturally evolve as we age the sort of a certain physician population out of practice.
So if would he be familiar with Athena, for example? He'd be more comfortable with Athena. But
he wouldn't need a course. He wouldn't need a course on how to use. I hope he wouldn't need a course. And the usability is a different. That's a whole. We can go down that rabbit hole if we want to. But he probably wouldn't need a course on how to use it. Whereas
I hope
physicians 45 plus or whatever, pick your arbitrary age cutoff, probably need a lot more support going down this road. I think the Amazon. If we can maybe move off Amazon for a second, I think a better example is Quicken. So if you think about Quicken in the 1980s, it was pretty silly software, right? It was, here's my receipt, here's my computer screen, and the numbers on the receipt actually match the numbers on the computer screen, and then you'd add them up, and then you'd add them up separately in your calculator, and it would look exactly the same. And tons of people bought these Quicken systems for reasons that we are mystified by now. But Quicken was sort of a kind of a natural, I think, glide path towards online banking. And I think that's the analogy that I see playing out here, which is right now we're in the process of just getting the information digital. And then eventually we'll start to animate it in interesting ways. And you have on this panel, you've got Nat, who is kind of at the forefront of trying to animate this data and actually do interesting things with it. And in 5 or 10 years, we won't be having the Amazon conversation. We'll be having more of the online banking conversation, which is how do we move the information around to make it actually useful and actionable?
And maybe just to carry on with that point, I mean, Nat, I'm going to come to you. So you are an example of someone who moved from the tech world to the healthcare world. And maybe you can just talk a little bit, I know you're entirely focused on oncology, but you are integrating, I guess, making an oncology cloud, so to speak, right? And how do people access that? And do you go directly to payers or providers or both, patients? I mean,
it's funny, so in my last business, we actually were one of those companies optimizing Amazon's website specifically. So basically, so we're an electronic medical record company for oncologists as well as an analytics tool for oncologists. And thankfully, and MSK is no different, cancer is one of those special diseases that most of the data is electronic, the majority, which is awesome. So I think probably in primary care, it's not the case, but in cancer, you really can't treat cancer these days unless you are using some sort of medical record system because the therapy, all this different stuff. So our company has proliferated because of the adoption of medical records in cancer. The challenge that our industry, oncology, has experienced is that data historically has just been used for billing. Doctors are sitting there typing in or speaking into their medical record system to get paid. And that's fine. That's kind of why the medical records first started to document care, and then it became a billing tool, and they have practice management systems, et cetera. But what's happened over the last 15 years is there's basically silos have been created of this data. And I think this is similar in other specialties like rheumatoid arthritis, neurology, et cetera, where in these subspecialties where there's a massive amount of data, millions of patients per year, where their treatments is basically documented as if they're on a clinical trial, but the data is stuck in the server in the closet of Sloan Kettering. And Sloan Kettering has been one of the few institutions that have analyzed their data, but it's always in isolation. At MSK, it's MSK's data. Flatiron, what we're trying to do is connect them all on the same platform and let them analyze everyone else's data in aggregate. So you put your own data in, you get data in return, 100-fold to what you have on your own. So if you have 2,000 lung cancer cases, we can show you 80,000 in our system in terms of what's being used. So and we get asked all the time, can we apply our techniques to other diseases? We probably will move into some benign hematology areas like anemia and things like that, and then RA, rheumatoid arthritis, and then some other specialties over time. My fear, and I agree with everything being said so far, is that we're such a long way off from that being the foundation of healthcare in general. I think it'll happen in cancer with our company, with some others first, and then you'll see the really expensive cost per patient diseases like cancer topple first, and then over time we might get to diabetes and some of these other areas longer term in terms of big data being used in a very meaningful way. But I'm a pessimist in general, so we'll see.
Maybe just to say something too about privacy. I mean, that's something that is on everybody's radar when they think about the data. I mean, it's great to have this data and have this data on a cloud and everybody can share it, but it's your health data.
So yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I was just going to, my own perspective on privacy is that, there's certain obvious disease areas where it really matters a lot, but if you talk to most sick people, what they really want is that, their information is available at the point of care, and they ultimately, would sacrifice a little bit of privacy to make sure that they weren't getting unnecessary tests, that they were getting the right, care at the right time. And so, I think oftentimes we think about privacy from a healthy person's perspective and not enough from a sick person's perspective.
Yeah, and I would say actually, I'm actually a big proponent of HIPAA. When I've read basically the entire HIPAA regs, it's not unfair. And maybe other tech companies would disagree with me, but there's actually ample room for companies like us to come into a clinic and work with a physician and have data on his or her patients, as long as you don't pose any harm to those patients, as long as the data is kept and there's a lot of documentation on how you hold that data, what you can do with it, what you can't do with it, what identifiers you have to strip, what you can leave in, how you can statistically, de-identify it, all this stuff. As far as Flatiron's concerned, privacy is actually well handled by HIPAA as long as you follow it. I think you have to self-police yourself. You have to be at risk for, audits, from various organizations that come in and make sure you're upholding to HIPAA. But HIPAA privacy to me is a pretty solved problem. We haven't really seen a big issue. It's a tax that we have to pay, but we're happy to do it.
I agree. I think that privacy is, the conversation around privacy is differentially driven by a relatively small number of individuals. I think that whenever we know just in the financial services industry, whenever we use our credit cards, that's being tracked to give consumer shopping profiles of what we do, and we voluntarily make that trade-off because, number one, we think it's more convenient to use a credit card. Number two, we don't mind the free offers that come with it. And so I think that obviously healthcare, there's much more at stake, but at the same time, if I go to the ED unconscious, then I would rather know that everybody knows my information about and can take the best possible care of me. And so I do think that there are these tensions. Personally, I would rather it be handled with something more akin to both HIPAA, HIPAA privacy and the do not call list. It's like do not ever share my information with anybody, as opposed to sort of a proactive. I need to get a consent from anyone to do anything that I want.
And I guess another issue that comes up a lot is, transparency. And we know now in November, the ACA, they're going to open up the exchanges again. And there was just an article that was interesting, actually, over the weekend in the New York Times that talked about, transparency, or what I would call lack of transparency, where actually, the Obama administration is not going to require that the insurers make their data available yet. And it seems like, that's such a cornerstone of ACA and the whole healthcare reform. So maybe I'll start with you, Dick.
Well, I think in fact, I'm going to probably turn it over to Ed because Ed's on the board of a company called Castlight Health out on the West Coast, which is focused on transparency. And I think there was just an article published this month in JAMA that talked about the impact of transparency on the actual transaction prices, and it was positive data. It's a small sample. It's a way to begin. As I recall, the amount of reduction in prices for physical devices was a lot more than the reduction in prices for doctor visits. Maybe that's a good outcome. We don't know. But it seems to me that the proposition that Castlight has put on the table for transparency is a good one, and it will bring costs down over time and have comparability between different sites, and put more of the responsibility on the consumer, if we can use that word, and I'm not comfortable with that word. I still think of patients, and I think that's what they are in most cases. So the patient can actually make a reasonable comparison for what they're getting.
I think it's right. I think that transparency are a natural requirement of any functioning market. And if you don't have transparency into price and or quality, it's very hard to make a decision. You end up having to make decisions based on available information, which tend to be the friend of a friend of a friend who knows someone who can get you to see someone else. So that's sort of the way that we end up making decisions these days, or based on the overall brand name of an institution. And so the study that Dick referred to, the JAMA study that showed that, and it's actually in some ways not surprising, it shows that when it comes to people will generally not shop individual doctors that much based on price. They'll do a little bit, but not a lot. But they will shop ancillaries a lot. So, basic labs, CBCs, MRIs, things that have very high variability in cost, but relatively low variable in outcome, are things that people are beginning to get comfortable shopping with today. And that's just a start to, I think, the transparency puzzle that we're beginning to put together. But it's an absolute requirement, and I think that it's a really exciting set of things that folks are doing relative to transparency in healthcare.
I just want to underscore the point Ed made about transparency around quality, because I think right now there's a huge emphasis on transparency around cost, but I think there needs to be simultaneously sort of more sophistication around quality measurement and more transparency around quality measurement, because in the absence of that and in the presence of only cost transparency, what we see is that a lot of patients will equate price with quality. And so for these non-commodity services.
So Sachin, what's your assessment of the state of the art on quality measurement these days?
I mean, I think we've got miles and miles and oceans to go.
Yeah,
really.
so do I. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, so sometimes we can measure quality from what I've seen in the hospital for the procedure that's been done, but in terms of 5-year survival rates and things like that, and that really make a difference at the end of the day to the patient, it seems that we're not very far along. Right?
I think that's right.
So to make the cost-quality trade-off is hard if you don't know what the quality is. Right.
So let me ask you guys, I'm going to kind of call out Zeke Emanuel here and ask you guys to kind of grade his commentary this morning. I didn't think anybody really fairly challenged him, especially even on innovation and where does that leave innovation. But go to the issue of, if you were to grade to date the impact of the Affordable Care Act, kind of your take, the Twitter moment on ACA. Maybe Sachin, start with you.
Well, Joel, I'll start by just asking what Zeke's typical speaking fee is, and if it's in excess of the cost of either. Anyways, my point is it's not life-saving. So, whereas a lot of what people in this room do is life-saving. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So I just pointing that out. So, I think the ACA. I think Elias Zerhouni made the point that it's really kind of created the necessary momentum to actually start changing things that people used to think were unchangeable. Ed made allusion to the Medicare Shared Savings Program. I mean, you have organizations that are actively thinking about managing population health and risk. That wasn't happening before the ACA. You've got 20 million new Americans who are actually getting healthcare coverage, who are now sort of consumers of products that are produced by people who are from companies who are sitting in this audience. So mess, but it's a great hot mess. It's a wild west of kind of new activity. You wouldn't even have this panel, frankly, if it weren't for the HITECH Act and the ACA. So these were areas that were just lying dormant and that were just stagnant. So I think it's a hot mess. I'll leave it there.
That's a great way to. Krishna, your take?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very thankful for both HITECH and ACA. I mean, I think if and obviously there's reasons that they happened kind of in the order that they did, insofar as HITECH, associated with the crash. But I think if we'd had our choice, we probably would have reversed the order and changed the payment structure first, and changed the incentives around what we want to be happening in hospitals and clinics, and then talk about wiring up the infrastructure. Because essentially what's happened is that we've incentivized most of our large hospital systems to choose existing EMRs, and that's still better than not having EMRs. But when we start talking about where we want our healthcare system to be, when we talk especially around kind of reaching outside of the clinic, they're really not set up for that. And when I think of the large systems that I've been a part of, or the system that I'm part of now, and think, now that there's a huge capital expenditure that's been made, how are we going to enable what comes next, after that? And I think from a pragmatic perspective, I think it's still better that it's there than that it's not. But it suggests that the tactic now is going to be integration into that system as opposed to what might have been a more exciting sort of future from a digital perspective, which is kind of rebuild those systems in a more exciting, interesting way from the ground up. But that's that's kind of spilt milk and actually quite minor. I think much more excited that it's all happening and would 100% agree that these are conversations that we weren't having just a few years ago. And I find it incredibly exciting that we're having them. As a venture person, anytime there's a huge shift in incentives like this, there's massive opportunities. So we're gearing up, and I think it's not exactly obvious how the whole system's gonna shift, but I think it's inevitable that there's going to be huge opportunities. So we're looking carefully around for the places we're going to make investments.
It was a long tweet.
Yeah, that's my blog. Blog moment.
And I'm sure most people know like meaningful use, which we've kind of alluded to, which helps our two companies. It's still mind-blowing to me that we had to pay doctors cash to make them adopt something with, as far as an EMR. So I agree with Krishna that, it would have been nice to start with, here's some reasons why you should use the EMR and make it a natural thing that they need to adopt. And I think with the ACA, one of the cool, exciting parts about it that Ed mentions, I don't think providers are going to ask for interoperability until the incentives change, and they're starting to. So at-risk systems, for example, are hugely incentivized to connect get their providers on a medical record system, and then second, start to have the systems communicate so that they don't have redundant tests and that care is coordinated, et cetera. So I think that's very exciting. The ACA is I agree, a hot mess. I don't think the ACO structure is perfect. No one does that I've met. It's an awesome first step towards coordinated at-risk care. And then the second part, which I see in the clinics that I visit that use our software with cancer, if you get a cancer diagnosis, the sad joke is you can't afford to get cancer. The cost of drugs and everything happening. And so, and a lot of patients show up in these clinics disproportionately that are uninsured because of the lifestyle that typically sometimes can lead, like with smoking and things that leads to cancer. So clinics are having to send patients to the hospital who then take on the care, kind of the indigent care, and then the state kind of reimburses. I like the ACA in that it's a movement towards making sure that you have to have everyone on health insurance if you're going to properly manage the population. But again, I think it is a hot mess, and we'll see where that all ends up. So,
high level, totally agree. I think it's a solid B minus, something like that. I mean, I like the way Krishna described the sequencing here. So there are really two things that we were trying to do. The first thing was that the government was trying to move the reimbursement system from a fee-for-service system to a fee-for-value system, where they're trying to lay the track in place to make that happen. But at the same time, and Dick, you talked about this earlier, there's no other industry where there are quite as many people with black suits and black ties and black sunglasses who are ready to take you off at a moment's notice and ready to get in the middle of your business on everything. They have black Fords that will just take you away. And I think that one of the unintended consequences of the High-Tech Act in particular is that it is kind of, it reminds me of a fly encased in amber, where it froze all the innovations in healthcare IT in a moment in time that preserved all of the systems that were necessary to make the fee-for-service environment run, and all of the technology that had been executed by committees to that date, and said everyone has to use this going forward. and it massively suboptimizes for the transition to fee-for-value that we all need to have happen. If you look at the medical record today, 4/5 of the medical record is actually not for the doctors, for the government, for the lawyers, and for everyone else, for the insurance companies, et cetera. It's not for the doctor. And so the reason that doctors haven't adopted EHRs is because they know the joke is on them.
Yes.
They know that, in fact, most of it's not helpful to them, and most of it's just gobbledygook to make sure that they stay out of jail and get paid the stuff that they need to. It's a little bit of the glass half empty version, but very, very true, right?
That's why they get paid to use it.
That's why. That's exactly why they have to get paid to use. And so you have this really, I think, odd scenario here where you have technology that, for all intents and purposes, is flying case in amber. At the same time that you're trying to do this thing, which is, I think, a worthy goal, which is value-based reimbursement.
Let me just make a comment. We're focusing on ACA quite appropriately, so, and it has been a positive, as maybe Ed's comment about a solid D-. But it took Congress a hell of a long time to put this D- into place, so there was a lot of work. At the same time that was going on, other things were going on in the marketplace, and there was consolidation going on in the marketplace. And we had hospital systems getting stronger and stronger all by themselves. And I think of Geisinger, for example, which I think does an absolutely terrific job. And they've certainly been helped by the ACA, and they know how to deal with that. But they were doing a lot of things in the first place. There's this whole other world out there of consolidation, which has been an equally big story, I think, to the ACA story, but doesn't get reported nearly as much. It's probably a little bit more difficult to report. But it's incredibly important, and it's not slowing down, it's accelerating. So I think we need to look at the whole set of things that we're doing in the United States, not just the things that the government are doing to understand where we stand in healthcare.
So, Lynn, let me interrupt you one more time for a second. So, Sachin, you're the representative from the pharma industry up here. What do you think, if you take what Zeke Emanuel said, that he said was coming down the pike 5, 7, 10 years, whatever it may be, one word I didn't actually hear out of his mouth, I haven't read his book, probably won't, unless somebody gave it to me, but was innovation and the impact of what he sees as the future on innovation. How do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think others on the panel with Zeke, said it just right. I mean, we need new products, we need new solutions to problems. I mean, Mike Rosenblatt, who's Merck's chief medical officer, frequently goes on record as saying, we're not going to, create a more efficient healthcare system to address the crisis that we have in Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Zerhouni said the same thing, and so the reality is that we, need this industry. One of the things that, as a relative newcomer to the industry, really from government, one of my kind of observations is we use all these kind of silly analogies. People talk about Kodak, and disruptive innovations and the need for us to remake this industry because if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to die. Well, those analogies are for industries where the need for the core product has gone away. The reality is we just have to get better developing our core product and stop beating ourselves up for it. We still need great drugs. We still need great vaccines. So my view is I'd like a rebate on the speaking fees that Zeke charges deposited in my bank account. So,
if I could build on that, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I think that's singularly the most exciting thing, in healthcare, ever, is just, the ability to create products that actually treat and cure. No matter what we talk about, around cost containment and kind of shifting risk, curing and treating and curing diseases, is kind of where the answer is ultimately at. And the fact that our drugs are expensive is just a reflection that we don't actually understand biology, and right. We don't actually have that many cures. We haven't cured, most forms of cancer. There's, maybe some pediatric elements where we can cure them, but it feels like we're in a moment where there's, technologies out there that are still early that do offer those sorts of outcomes, and I think that is that's a pure representation that this isn't a zero-sum game, right? Technology can move the world forward. It can cure things, and I do feel like that's often lost in the conversation around digital health and stuff like that. I mean, you can see that in technology too, in the IT industry as well, that it's not a zero-sum game. Humans can create fundamentally new science and new things, discover things that totally change the game. And we just haven't seen that much of it, in the biotech industry. People in the tech industry, sometimes like to bag on the pharma industry. I think lately there's been the e-rooms law that's kind of made the circuits of Moore's law backwards, and I think it takes longer and longer and more expensive to develop each new drug, and it doesn't actually have to be that way. I think there are, like I said, there are technologies, in the therapeutics industry that I think are, increasingly coming down the pipe that I think will change those sorts of things. I know it's the sort of stuff that people in this room are spending a lot of time thinking about. So, I think his comments are actually, spot on. That innovation really can kind of move this forward.
One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is, really kind of when we're focusing on empowering the patient, is the power of mobile technology. And I was really fascinated when we were putting together the Digital Health Summit that every time I asked somebody what their definition of digital health, it was very different. But most of the people gravitated towards, it's my app, it's my iPhone, it's telemedicine. I mean, now you see commercials on TV, and it's taking the hospital to the home. And I'd just like to hear all of you and kind of your opinion on it. It's important, obviously, to this whole equation, but where are we today?
So I track 2,167 healthcare IT companies.
That's a few
You
hundred
might
more than
wonder
us.
how well I track them, and I would think that would be a very good question. But I've identified 2,167 of them. There's about 140 new healthcare IT companies being formed per year for the last 7 or 8 years. It's gone up from 120 a year. So, I mean, there's a lot of people thinking they have a lot of good ideas out there. It's really quite extraordinary what's happening. And I don't think we've been focusing on EHRs today, and that's a very important place that we have started. But it's not the end game. As I think about it from our New Haven perspective, we have very good tertiary and quaternary care in New Haven. And part of the consequence of that is our primary care system wouldn't really be thought of as the pace center for the nation. But with the Internet of Things and with all these devices, could one imagine redesigning primary care from the ground up? Absolutely, one could imagine doing that. How many of these 140 new companies a year would be involved in that? Well, it would be a pretty good percentage. How many hospital systems in the United States are now saying, gee, 2,167 companies. I wonder if I'm getting all the value I could be from those 2,167 companies. I better start thinking about talking to them and adjusting my purchasing processes now, which are adjusted now to optimize the cost and delivery of standard products, so that I can incorporate new products into my systems within the hospital, which requires me to change the system. So I think all that is work yet to be done. And I think it's beyond the EHR, and I think it's one of the most exciting parts about innovation in healthcare.
I think I totally agree with all that stuff. I think that if you look at the system, and this is why I think that it really, when you talk about digital health, and the reason you get so many different answers to it, and part is because healthcare really is 1,000 different submarkets.
Right.
So thousands of different submarkets in healthcare, each of which is billions of dollars in size. And so there's the tertiary, quaternary care. The prices of that stuff honestly should be higher than it is today, because today that some of the low-end care is being subsidized by the high-end care is being subsidized by some of the more commodity care out in the field. So I think that with respect to the mobile revolution, I think that if you read Dick's book, The Attacker's Advantage, that he wrote back in, you see that
1850, I think, is when it came out.
It's the way it came out. But it's a terrific book. I mean, it talks about the idea of this, about doing things that no one really wants to do at the edges a little bit. So how do you, and that's the stuff that you're going to start doing with mobile technology. So there are a bunch of folks who are beginning to do, for example, telemental health. No one really wants to do mental health. It's not really that interesting. But if you begin to do telemental health, you get good at that. then you're going to be able to construct a catchment area that gets wider and wider and wider and wider. So what I'm really excited about is this idea that you're going to be able to see a lot of this innovation at the edges. I don't know which of those experiments will be successful. The only thing I know is that some of them will be successful. And then we're going to get to the next layer, and then the next layer, and the next layer, and the next layer. And pretty soon, I think it will become pervasive.
Are we talking mobile here? Is that what we're doing? Mobile. Okay. So as probably a little controversial, I am super skeptical of mobile today in its current form. I just don't think most patients, frankly, give a crap about engaging with their medical record. If I could short startups that have an idea to have a patient-focused app, I would. But there's a couple models that have worked that are engaging around biometric tracking steps, and you could bucket those inside of healthcare, and they have a lot of implications with primary care. Prescribing, for example, MyFitnessPal, whatever it's called, would be a good idea. But I think until we figure out how to provide value back to the patients, most don't really care about their health until they're sick. I think most people in this room, my friends, family, like kind of frankly, like the richer, folks, like they have the time and energy and the wherewithal to wear the bands and get engaged with their health, and they're very active. When I go to the cancer clinics that I go to, it's a really far-fetched. So I would love to see that happen. I think mobile will at some point in time revolutionize healthcare, but I don't know if we're even close to that yet. Amen. Okay.
Yeah, I'd probably largely agree with that. I would actually make the analogy to like the electric car sort of universe where my guess is most people who are driving electric cars aren't driving them because they're really keeping such close track of their carbon footprint and really want, at least in Silicon Valley, that's not why they're driving them. It's because they're kind of cool. They're kind of a fashion statement of sorts, and so when I think of how mobile starts to have any sort of impact here, I'm also incredibly skeptical, from kind of what we've seen out there so far. But it feels like it's something in that genre where it's like, it's probably not that you're wearing the thing or using your phone to like protect yourself from, a stroke. You're probably wearing it for some other reason. I think that's the reason that people wear the stuff that they wear now. My wife got one of the ups, and she was asking her, she's a physician, I was asking her about it, and like she had worn it for like 3 weeks and had never plugged it into her phone. She had like no idea what her activity was, but just like, she kind of just liked it as a bracelet. And I was like, well, okay. And then, you know what, that's actually not a bad way to get that sort of data and kind of engage people. The reality is most people in the healthcare industry don't have that skill set of like how you get into somebody's mind to think about how you kind of hook into that habit. The people who I see in my venture life who have that are the people in the gaming industry. They're the people who've created like Angry Birds. And this is like a totally, that group of people does not know where the FDA is. They don't know what HIPAA is, and like they're kind of not sure kind of how to engage with health. When they do, a lot of those folks do come to our office and say, hey, I'm like interested in doing, I don't want to sell any more digital ads. I want to do something in health. Most of them get bored as they learn about the health industry, right? Like they kind of get 3 months or 4 months into it, and they're like, oh, this is like really painful. I'm just going to do something in diabetes or nutrition. It's just consumer. I don't have to think about it. And then there's very few people who kind of actually get deep into the morass of healthcare, and that's actually where we need those people to be. And I don't yet fully know. Not here in this room right now, but they need to be.
So usually I'm the pessimist on the panel. I'll be the optimist, unfortunately. So I think that the greatest opportunity is actually to connect people to the traditional healthcare system. So I think the way most people think about mobile is they think this is this thing that exists on the side that's going to help the patient, but I don't want to do the work to kind of connect them with New York Presbyterian Hospital or North Shore LIJ or Mass General. I think the greatest opportunity is actually to create the connectivity between the patient and his or her healthcare providers by trying to create the sort of high-touch, low-cost, continuous interaction And it's not going to be necessarily about activity tracking, but it's going to be about the things that actually matter to patients. To Dick's previous point about quality measurement, it's going to be about measuring quality, measuring things that matter, and frankly, it's going to primarily be focused on high engagement conditions that actually matter to patients, as opposed to some lower engagement issues. We did this project with Patients Like Me at a great cost to our company in the area of psoriasis, and tried to capture patient sentiment around psoriasis, much as Patients Like Me has done around ALS. And it would probably come as no surprise to all of you that we had a hard time actually getting people to report their data about psoriasis, because psoriasis is not ALS. That's my Twitter. That's my Twitter moment. Psoriasis is not ALS. Largely because I think high investment diseases engage people, whereas low investment diseases don't. So low impact rather. So I think where mobile can have a real impact is in these high impact conditions that are underserved by the traditional healthcare system.
So one other just out of the box question, is there a role for philanthropy in digital health, do you guys think?
I actually think it would be harmful in some way. I mean, there's probably some element in terms of like infrastructure building and stuff like that. And I guess we should be, digital health is vague, so like, there are probably places in the enterprise side, but I think as it speaks to kind of consumer engagement and those sorts of things, I feel like those are very market-driven things. Those are things where if you're hiding the fact that company's not generating revenue because its product's not actually working, I think I could see it being harmful. Yeah, that's what I think.
I tend to agree. So I think that it would have to be thought about on a case-by-case basis. But I was on a panel out in the West, and there was hosted by a large university, and the question was asked of some of the folks in the university and for some of the folks in the room, if you had $10 million, what would you do with it? How would you actually help make the health system better? And the answers, that started to come back is like, with $10 million, I can't do anything. I need at least $1 billion to get anywhere. But I actually think that what that prevents is there's so much money that's floating around that it prevents this idea of just becoming more efficient. How do we think about using what we have better and more efficiently? And I think that if we can find a way to harness all of the money that's floating around now better and more effectively, then that is going to be better than actually pouring more money into the system.
So I think of philanthropy as serving agendas that are being undervalued, and I would say that right now digital health is not an agenda that's being undervalued. In fact, it's probably being overvalued. There's a huge bubble, right? So I think that the real opportunity, maybe the sort of the underfunded opportunity, is around cross-sector innovation and social determinants of health. And trying to get society to see that health is about a lot more than just what hospital you go to, what primary care doctor you go to, what EMR you use, it's what medicines you're taking. I think right now the biggest opportunity in philanthropy is that sort of cross-sector innovation. So
I just wanted to see if there's any questions from the audience. Yes?
A few comments.
Okay.
First, in answer to Richard, yes, there are departments of information technology and medicine. We started one at Columbia about 20 years ago, and they do research and work in the hospital and out of the hospital in terms of seeing how far and what they can do with digital health. Second, with regard to the comment that people find they get bored in healthcare, maybe certain groups of people do, but you'd be amazed that we have about 50,000 people coming into medical schools each year because they want to help people. One of the things that frustrates me about this kind of conversation is that we forget a little bit. There's a human exchange being enacted, and people want in that what they want. And I'm glad that Jain said that it's not undervalued. What we want is your technology to help us do it better.
Yes. Over here.
I'm an internist by training for years. Actually worked with Merck.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm an internist by training, but I actually worked at Merck for most of my career, starting with Dr. Vagelos, great mentor. And I think that, we're looking at, I always looked at technology, and we never looked at process. And so we used to put a lot of technology into a lousy process, and we ended up with great technology and lousy process. So I think that I recognize, and I think I can echo what the gentleman just said before me, that doctor-patient relationship, we have to reinvigorate again, which we haven't. And as a primary care doc, I can tell you that the system is fragmented and broke. So until we get that process straight, and I feel I'm an air traffic controller, and I tell the patients, would you fly into New York, into LaGuardia, Kennedy, or Newark without an air traffic controller? Because they have more specialists than you can shake a stick at, but they have no internist tying it all together. So you're trying to put digital health, you could do it with oncology, but try doing it with primary care. It's very difficult. So I think until we get, and I think a Geisinger is a great example of an integrated delivery system where you can have all the pieces and specialties of medicine and coordinate it, you can have a system. So in that respect, one thing I probably would agree with Dr. Emanuel, an integrated delivery system can be effective, like an Intermountain or a Geisinger or Virginia Mason or a Kaiser. So I think that's the thing I would look at first. Talk to the docs your physicians, who take care of patients, and they'll tell you where the gaps are. And also, how do you engage patients? I'll tell you that most patients don't care about their health. It's the worried well that's going to go onto those apps. But you want the people who really need to get the help, and I deal with it every day as far as getting people to get interested in that. And luckily, I can do it in a setting that's in an employer setting where people are in the same building where I can actually work with them, and I actually communicate with them by email, see how they're doing, and it's like a concierge practice. And they say, I never had a doctor follow up like this. You'll get a lot more out of patients knowing that they care about you, and they'll follow your lead than just someone who they see once in a while or go to an urgent care center. So I think you got to really focus on that. And if you can find some pockets where you have that type of an integrated delivery system, try to expand it. I think digital health would be a lot more effective.
Great, Galien.
Yeah, that's, I think, pretty profound comment.
I wanted to make a comment about patient privacy and security because very often I think our systems are really secure, and those of us who are immersed in it think that either they're safe or it's okay. People are sharing a lot of information on Facebook, a lot of private information, but I think it's really hard to believe that these systems are airtight when you read that the banks have been hacked by foreign hackers, that credit card systems like Target and others, and New Jersey just tallied the last 10 years, and people leaving laptops or thumb drives around have led to over 1 million personal medical records being available to whoever wants them. And so I think we're not taking the right approach by assuring people that these are airtight when the National Security Administration can be broken into. I think what we need to do is get informed consent to people. At the beginning, your records, there's a chance associated with it. And in terms of sharing, I think we should apply the same principle that we apply in medicine all the time, which is benefit risk. Is the particular benefit that we might get for moving this record around at this time worth the potential risk? And if that's favorable, then let's go ahead, especially if we have informed consent. If we don't, I think we need to be more cautious than we currently are. I'd be interested in comments from any of you.
Can I comment on it? I just personally just think informed consent, if it poses no risk. So I'm a little bit on the opposite end of the spectrum from you. Informed consent would stifle innovation for big data. I agree with you. Like most of the breaches in data are people who leave their laptop in the taxi cab.
Happens.
There's no software that I could write or Krishna could write that would prevent Sachin from leaving his, laptop. Not to pick on you.
I'm always that guy on the panel.
So what needs to happen is not so much the technology, it's the process around it. So for example, ensuring encryption of laptops so that if someone leaves it in the trunk, if someone opened it, they couldn't get to the records. There's nothing we can do to prevent that. I don't even think informed consent would even help, because even if you put your, I mean, what are you going to sign up for? You're going to say, I'm recognizing that Sachin might have my data on my laptop and leave it in the cab. I think what we need is more self-policing and auditing to make sure that those standards are being upheld. But if you put an informed consent down, I mean, the amount of data that companies and government could work with will plummet down.
Yeah.
I mean, very small percentage.
I had one comment to that. These medical records over time are going to have more and more genomic information
That's true.
in them. And you're probably aware of the publication from the Whitehead Institute last year that showed that using their genomic database, demographic information, Facebook and
You can
other
link them
public
to the
things,
family tree.
they could uniquely identify people. Not only that, they could identify their family members because of genomics. So
Use it in
I
those
don't think
cases.
there's an encryption system that's going to be able to keep up with this. I think we need a different approach other than false reassurances, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels exactly right. I mean, but the right answer is not to just stop, right? The correct answer is not to just say, well, okay.
I wasn't
But and I don't think that's what you're. I don't hear that in what you're suggesting. But I hear that from other parts of the government, other parts of the NIH, other parts of because this is a scary thing that's happening. That these large data sets are being aggregated. There's clearly huge amounts of value to be derived for everybody by these data sets being together. It is impossible to fully protect anything. I mean, I think that's now been proven. So, you know, I think you're right. It's risk benefit, but I guess it's not risk benefit, you know, each, you know, one at a time. Or it can't be, we can't take the Luddite view that like this can't ever, you know, kind of be operated at scale, but we can't also, you know, just do it willy-nilly. So there has to be something in the middle, and anytime you're in the middle, it's gray and there's trade-offs. And there'll be issues as it happens, and I think we have to be ready for that. At the same time, I think that's part of technology moving forward.
Ed said something really important, which is that the national privacy dialogue is really being dominated by a few voices, and I think we need a much richer dialogue. To your point, Mike, about sort of how data is used, how it's not used, decision rights. I think the typical conversation is, information should be private in all circumstances, and I think Nat brings up some important use cases where it's not in the best interest of society, it's not in the best interest of science to necessarily do that.
Genomics is huge.
I mean, to that end, I think that one of the most interesting solutions to this that I've seen is to reduce the economic value of that information. So things like anti-discrimination laws for health insurance are one of the key things. I mean, the reason that people go in and you have nation-state hackers who try to go in and steal credit card numbers is that they have value. You can actually use them for one-time transactions and in relatively untraceable ways. If you have someone's genomic profile but you can't do anything with it, then there's no economic reason that someone's going to go in and try to take it, or if they find out that you have it, but if you have it, you're going to go to jail. So I think that there are things to think about on the use part of the data and reducing the economic incentives that anyone would ever want to get to the data to begin with.
I think genomic companies like Foundation should, and this is one of his investments, it should be considered that they would need to get patient consent if they are to send. It should be held to a higher standard than a medical record.
So we're almost 8 minutes over. We have one final question from, and then they're going to shut us down, I think.
I know that if you were looking at today's population, a lot of the folks wearing Fitbits are wearing well. If we think about the future of digital health, and all you guys are in this, wearables, digestibles, predicted to be $7–10 billion. If you had to prioritize the top 2 or 3 buckets 5–10 years out, maybe 5 years out from now, in terms of data aggregation with Flatiron and oncology, like what would you prioritize as the top 2 or 3 areas you would focus on?
Sounds like she's asking for a stock tip, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Or places to build.
I wouldn't, I have no stock tips, but I would focus on primary care. I think it's low-hanging fruit, and I could imagine all kinds of things. which are not high-tech, they're not moonshots. And hopefully they would avoid, or they could be designed in a sensitive way to deal with the comments about privacy, which I agree with. And I think we could do that on a reasonably small scale. And I'd love to see a series of experiments privately funded by cities and states of the right size to go after primary care and use these tools to improve primary care.
Now, within primary care, I would further sub-focus on home health. I think that the ability to take, for someone to be able to age gracefully in home is critically important, and I think technology has the unique capability to do that.
Even if they're aging from 4 to 6.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, for me, it'd be population health management tools that connect systems and allow risk-bearing institutions or networks to manage their population, kind of like an operating system for a risk-bearing entity.
Yeah, I think to the earlier comment, the place where it's really needed is things around primary care and wellness. I think those are, but I don't know how to do those. I think that's incredibly challenging. So if I was thinking about it from an investment perspective, if I had infinite cash, I would certainly pour a lot of it into that. I think from a profit motive perspective, I think places like cancer, places where there's a profound disease, where the patient's really motivated, where the data can have some sort of impact in a near term, I think those sorts of things are where you're going to see the actual growth.
Physician disenchantment. I would be working on tools that reduce physician disenchantment.
Well, you just had maybe the best set of advice. Great question, great wind up. Thank you to this has been an all-star panel, and Lynn for making it happen. Thanks to you, and thanks to the pre-Galien. Thanks, everybody.